Hi, good evening, everyone. Sorry if my voice sounds a little raspy. Have a little bug going on, but I want to welcome everyone to another Fasting Work Girl Chat. Tonight we are going to do a brief Q&A, but I did want to go over an article that raised concerns regarding egg consumption and just go through that and show you why this study really doesn't deserve the media attention and press that it's getting, and kind of just review a little bit about statistics. I don't want to get too stats heavy. I will also post the link to some articles in my stories, which if you're interested in learning more about stats, you can use that as a guide so that when you are reviewing publications, you will have ability to know whether or not these are appropriate studies and if they're really worth your time. So let's go ahead and just read the summary for this study. So I'm going to be looking at my computer and looking back and forth. But the study that's causing a lot of buzz in the media is called Associations of Dietary Cholesterol or Egg Consumption with Incident Cardiovascular Disease and Mortality. And when you basically, their key question was, is consuming dietary cholesterol or eggs associated with incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality? That was the question. So what they did was they pooled data together from 6 different prospective cohort studies. So this was not a randomized clinical controlled trial. These were observational studies, meaning that we can't affect the exposure, anything about that. And so we're just observing what happens over time. So in this study, they concluded after following almost 30,000 people over time that dietary cholesterol and egg use or egg consumption was associated with higher risk of death and higher risk of cardiovascular events. And so their conclusion was that among U.S. adults, higher consumption of dietary cholesterol or eggs was significantly associated with a higher risk of incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality in a dose-response manner. This should be considered in the development of our dietary guidelines. So pretty strong words, especially for an observational study. Though that's a pretty bold statement. Observational studies usually cannot make that large of claims. And so let's talk about more why that is. So if anyone has an interest in stats, there are a series of articles by a Dr. David Grimes and Dr. Kenneth Schultz, which talks about interpreting statistical data. And so in their paper entitled, Most Reported Associations in Observational Clinical Research Are False, and the minority of associations that are true are often over-exaggerated, get at this tale, okay? So the problem is when you are doing observational research, meaning that you cannot control the exposure. You can't control exposures, you can't control biases or biases. So the problem is that we all-cause mortality. So did some of these people die from car accidents? Did they, because all causes, right? What did they die of? What were their heart attacks from? What was actually going on? It's very hard to say it was the egg. In general, when we're looking at observational studies, there's something called a relative risk. And basically what the relative risk is, it's a ratio of a probability of an event occurring in the exposure group versus the probability of the event occurring in a non-exposed group. So for instance, this study used hazard ratios, which is going to get a little too in depth, so I'm not going to go that far, but basically a hazard ratio is kind of like a relative risk, but it's time specific. However, when we look at what these ratios were, it's important to keep in mind that typically most scientists and statisticians consider relative risk less than 2, and certainly relative risk less than 3 if you're being conservative, are probably just due to chance from running large data sets. So if I have a database of 30,000 people, if I run enough statistical calculations, I'm going to find something that's statistically significant, whether or not that is truly clinical significant. And that's the problem with just running numbers, right? So when we go back and look at the numbers that they're reporting in some of the confidence intervals for this egg study, for instance, when we look at the higher risk of cardiovascular incidents, their adjusted hazard ratio was 1.06. A hazard ratio relative risk of 1 would be not significant. This was barely significant, which is easily just due to chance associations in calculations. Further looking at that, the confidence interval was from 1.03, because you always report it in a range, to 1.1. So none of those were near 2 if we want to be lax, 3 if we want to be stringent, that any of this should really raise an eyebrow. This comes from a database which was mined, which if you run anything enough times and do different statistical calculations, you'll find that, especially when later on in the paper they talk about dose-dependent responses. So for instance, there's a claim later on in the paper for every additional half egg that you eat a day. So the first thing I thought about, I'm sorry, has anyone ever, how do you eat half an egg? I mean, I guess if you hard boil it and then you eat it and you slice it right down the middle. But if you're doing, a scrambled egg, once it's all scrambled, how would you calculate half of that? In an omelet. So if I eat half an omelet, but I use 3 eggs, so is that 1.5 eggs? Right. So, I mean, the numbers, you can start to see this was just database manipulation. The other thing is the study is really only, so it may have looked at almost 30,000 people, but the study itself is only going to be as good as the parts that make the sum, right? The individual studies, because keep in mind, this pooled results from 6 different studies, right? So let me tell you, some of the studies, one of the largest data sets contributing to this study, interviewed people with a food diary at the beginning of the study. That was it. So imagine I ask all of you 17.5 years ago, I'd asked you in the past and followed you in time, 17.5 years ago, for you to describe your diet, okay? Just once. So I didn't ask you again over those 17.5 years and say some of you died, some of you had a heart attack. So is it really because of that entry questionnaire that you gave me 17.5 years ago to your guesstimate, a snapshot in time of how many eggs you ate a day? And that's going to be representative of what you did over the last 17.5 years from now? Because I can personally tell you, if I would have participated in a study 17.5 years ago, and you compared what my diet looks like today versus my diet 17.5 years ago, it's completely different. So many of these studies didn't have follow-up over time, or they had follow-up like once in the first year and maybe a couple follow-ups after that. And it wasn't even like, here, show me your food diary. It wasn't that they were keeping logs on MyFitnessPal every month or every whatever. It was like, okay, well, over a 24-hour recall, remember, let's see what you ate, and then that's going to extrapolate out to what you probably eat every day. So I'm sorry. So for anyone who wants to jump to this study and say, see, they ate eggs and see what happened 17 years later, we have no idea how their diets changed over time. Also, when you look at the appendix section, which many people don't read because we just like to read the abstract and just go with whatever conclusion someone makes. But in the appendix section, when you look at some of the food questionnaires that they used, I mean, I'm not trying to be nitpicky, but they didn't even categorize fruits and vegetables right when they were asking the participants about it. So for instance, they tried to estimate like how many fruits a day do you eat? How many servings of vegetables do you eat? They listed tomatoes as a vegetable. Tomatoes are not a vegetable. Tomatoes are a fruit. They listed cucumbers and squash as vegetables. Those are fruits. They couldn't really figure out how to categorize juice, whether or not they were going to put that as a fruit or not. So they made their own category. So I'm just sorry. It's a poorly designed. It's a poorly designed study. You cannot use a questionnaire given once 17 years ago that you then are extrapolating on forever. Now, again, there were 6 different studies, so this gets at more of the bias in the studies. Some studies did do multiple questionnaires. So they did, one at 1 year and they did another one at 2 year. But again, I still don't know that if you take the average person and ask them from year to year, how many eggs do you think you ate? How that goes. I mean, because you're relying on recall bias. So it's just a really poorly done study. So aside from trying to draw, conclusions from one point in time, and following people forward, I think the biggest proof is just in their hazard ratios, which all of them were near 1. So honestly, in observational research, we should not even blink an eye to that. So you may say, well, it's observational, right? We can't randomize people to eat eggs and not to eat eggs and see what happens over 17 years. Completely agree. But let's review some observational studies that were really, that really did show something going on. So for instance, it was an observational study that actually got us looking into whether or not lung cancer was associated with cigarette smoking. And just in comparison, to this study that has hazard ratios of 1.17 relative risk. Okay, so for the study, the landmark study done where we looked at cigarette smoking and death from cancer. For cigarette smoking, the relative risk was 8. 8. Okay, that's huge. Not 1, not 1.1, not 1.5. 8 times the relative risk if you smoked 1 to 4 cigarettes per day. 20 was the relative risk for 15 to 24, and 32, and up to 32 for cigarettes of 25 more per day. Okay. So those numbers are huge in comparison. So I see there's a question, what are some things non-medicine people should look for when analyzing the study? I think you need to see what the relative risks were. If it were a prospective study or if it was a case control study, then you're going to look at the odd ratio. And you need to look at those bars. So they'll report a number and then there are bars in between. And you need to see actually what the relative risk or odd ratios were. If they're near 1, certainly if they're under 2, this is probably just due to chance. If it is above 2, then you can start to maybe give a little credence to it. But remember, observational studies cannot prove causation. They're just associations. So for example, you can't rule out the biases. So let's give an example that people who drive cars are at higher risk of lung cancer. I'm making that up. But let's say there was a study that showed that association. But let's say the society was a magical society where if you didn't drive cars regularly, you were less likely to smoke cigarettes. But if you did drive cars regularly, you were more likely to smoke cigarettes. But because that is another factor and you're not accounting for that in your analysis, you conclude that people who drive cars get lung cancer. When it's not really the car, it's the confounder of the cigarette smoking, which you don't have an ability to control for. So observational studies can be full of confounders, and we use statistical methods to try to control them. But in this particular study, the fact that so much of the data was based on asking someone their diet at the beginning of a 17.5 period, then checking to see if they were alive in 17 years and saying, oh, it must have been because of these eggs that you claimed that you ate at the beginning of these 17.5 years it's just poorly done. So I think, right, everything in moderation. We say that all the time. I don't know that anyone needs to eat, 30 eggs a day, but there's nothing in here that should scare people away from eating eggs. Maybe conventional eggs where they lock the chickens up and don't let them see sun, maybe use this opportunity to find a local farmer who sells true free-range eggs that aren't using antibiotics and things like that in the food. I mean, I think that is good with any meat that we're eating, right? Because sometimes we're doing terrible things to conventionally raised meat, and we should be eating it in its natural form possible. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but this study does not deserve the press that it's getting. And I was a little disappointed to see so many medical people on Instagram reposting just this abstract and saying like, see, look, eggs kill you. No, they don't. They don't. There's nothing in here that shows that eggs kill you. This is just simple looking at statistics. And so I think we just all need to go back and revisit it. So I'm going to post Dr. Grimes's article also in my Insta stories in case you all want to learn more about odds ratios and relative risk. But I think you need to keep this in mind. Also, anytime when you're reading in the news and they just present the percentages and they don't give you the confidence intervals, raise your eyebrow, go back and pull the original study. Because I think most people looking at this study, like when you actually read it, you're like, no, JAMA. I know it's JAMA, but no, this is not anything noteworthy. So that's the short of that, and hopefully it was helpful. But I don't think you need to give up your eggs. The other thing, just for note's sake, there has not been borne out in actual trials and such that dietary cholesterol actually raises blood cholesterol. The metabolism is not a 1-for-1. So it's not because I eat an egg that has cholesterol in it, now my cholesterol has shot up 500 points. And I hear people say that all the time. Oh, I just ate that. I bet my cholesterol just went up. I'm like, no, because it's not a 1-for-1, guys. Same thing. We're trying to simplify the human body too much. A calorie in doesn't equal a calorie out. There's so many things that go into how your body uses that calorie that you can't assume the body is a 1-for-1 equation. It's not. It's not input equals output. There's a lot more that goes into it. Food quality, just all sorts of things. So we have to keep that in mind. Okay, so enough of that soapbox. I do want to get through some questions. You all submitted a ton of questions, and so I'm actually probably going to do a part 2 next week, even though I'm usually just doing Q2 weeks now. But there were so many good Q questions asked through my Insta stories and my DMs and on the post today that I do want to try to get to them all, and I won't be able to do that all tonight, or we'll be on here for an hour. So I know Reduced Fat Mama said, I've always wondered about eggs and cholesterol. Hopefully that cleared it up a little bit, but you don't need to stop eating your eggs. So, sorry, the camera's shaking a little bit. Let's go to some of your questions. All right. So, She Wolf Eats asked, do you think extended fasts are more effective for weight loss? And so my answer to that is not necessarily. I think there's the conception that people feel in order for you to lose weight with intermittent fasting that you need to do a 24-hour, 36-hour, 48-hour fast. And that's not true. So we do have evidence from studies on Ramadan participants who, depending on what time of year Ramadan is falling, may do a 12-hour fast that's sun up to sunset. It could be 13 to 16 hours, depending on, again, when the sun rises and when the sun sets. And we've seen, though, just from that 12 to 16 hour fasting during Ramadan, that many metabolic factors are improved at the end of the month without changing dietary intake. Many participants reported weight loss in the trials. If you have friends who celebrate Ramadan, ask them, do they notice weight loss? A lot of people do notice weight loss during Ramadan, or if it's not just pure weight loss, they'll notice inches reduced or things like that. So no, you don't have to do an extended fast just to lose weight. I think it's going to be whatever you can do consistently over time while improving your food quality. So I know there's camps for everything, right? So there are one popular mantra that says, delay, don't deny. So it's basically, as long as you fast, you can eat whatever you want. I personally disagree with that. I think that the point of fasting, while it's resetting your metabolic health, improving your insulin sensitivity, allowing for autophagy, depending on how long you're fasting, getting at some of those other metabolic health markers, it's not that you're fasting so that then you can just eat whatever or binge. That's counterproductive. So fasting really should be incorporated with healthy nutrition. Healthy nutrition looks like different things for different people. Some people are more plant-based. I don't think there's anything wrong with incorporating plants. I think plant foods are healthy for most people, but there are people who have intolerances to nightshade family. There are people who have allergic reactions. And so you've also seen the zero carb trend, or what people also call carnivore, in terms of where people are just eating meat, and who are also reporting reversal of autoimmune diseases, similarly to people who go vegan and say, now my autoimmune disease is no more. So I think you just have to find the whole foods, real diet that works for you. Listen to your body. And if you're becoming more metabolically healthy and reversing disease conditions, then you've probably found, what works for you. But I just don't think a diet rich in processed foods is going to do that for anyone. So the next question I had was asked, do artificial sweeteners in gym? I think that's probably meant to say gum. I'm going to change it to gum. So do artificial sweeteners in gum or mints hinder ketosis or mess up your fast? So technically, yes. So the problem is, so there's a few different ways that we can define fasting. Fasting in its purest form is going to be abstaining from any food, any caloric intake, whether that's artificial sweeteners or anything, cream, blah, blah, just really should just be water only. However, many people fast with aids such as coffee, tea, or bone broth, even though that would not technically be considered a fast. That's really not going to affect your insulin sensitivity. I mean, it's not going to spike your insulin, so that you're still getting the majority of the benefits of fasting. But once you start adding sweeteners, just because there's not calories in the sweetener, the sweet taste will spike your insulin. And so because of that, you have to, that basically is defeating the purpose of your fast. You do also have to be careful about the amount of calories you're consuming during a fast, because if you're going over 200 calories, then that can also affect, your fast in terms of spiking insulin too much. So then you're actually out of the fasted state. So hopefully that answers your question. But that's gonna mess it up. Now, the other part, sorry, you guys are seeing my boxes. My kids made a fort. I don't know if you guys can tell from behind me, but this is the fort. So the camera's slipping a little bit, sorry. Put that back. But that's one of the things you'll have to keep in mind. Now, fasting and ketosis, while most people when they fast are in ketosis, are different things. So, for instance, while you may have a mint, if you're already in deep ketosis, that's probably not going to knock you out. If you have several mints, it probably will. but that may mess up your fast. So, I mean, it's two different items that you're getting at there. But in general, I really wouldn't chew gum while fasting. I mean, if you do it every once in a while, fine, but I would try to avoid that, and I would try to avoid the mints. Let's see. So the next question was, what about, this is along the sweeteners question. So what about monk fruit or natural sweeteners, etc., during fasting? And again, I would say no, you really want to avoid whether they're natural sweeteners or whatnot. Stevia, I'm not necessarily a big fan of that, because even though we say it's natural, it's highly processed by the time it gets to you. So unless you're growing your own stevia leaves and just putting them directly in its natural form into your coffee, then I wouldn't do that. Now, this doesn't mean you have to do this all at once, right? It's going to take a while, especially if you're used to having sweeteners. So a lot of people will get the bridge from, regular sugar to things like monk fruit and stevia, and then eventually wean off those. So just play around with it and try different things with that. Let's see. So, someone just asked in general, when I say a shorter fast, what do I typically mean by that? When I say a shorter fast, I usually mean about 12 to 16 hours, which if you've never fasted that long before, it can seem like a long fast, but keep in mind you can use your sleeping time to count towards your fasting hours. There was a question that says, is it normal to gain weight when reintroducing food after an extended fast of 24 hours plus? And the answer to that is yes, because a lot of times when you're doing your fast, especially at 24 hours, especially between the 24 and 36 hour mark, a lot of the weight that you're losing is going to be water weight. You're going to diurese. And so then once you begin eating again, you will retain that water weight. So it's not uncommon to see people regain the weight that they lost from an extended fast. So that's what you have to get into. What is the purpose of your fast? So if you're fasting and you're like, I'm going to do a 3-day water fast because I have to lose 10 pounds in 3 days. So probably not a good reason to do a fast, because you're going to gain that weight back. People use extended fast for several reasons that honestly go beyond weight loss. So if you're doing an extended fast just because you think you want to lose weight at the end of that extended fast, I would caution you and say that extended fasting may not be for you, because you use extended fasting to break up weight loss plateaus. So for instance, if you have been stuck at the same weight for several weeks and you think that your body set weight has adjusted to this new level so that your body's trying to hold on to weight, you could use an extended fast to break up your insulin sensitivity and then also reset the body set point to a lower point, then making it such that you would lose weight, not necessarily keep it off with that extended fast, but in the subsequent weeks, it would then help losing weight to become more efficient. Some people do extended fasts for autophagy. So for instance, there's a lot of research coming out of California in terms of people undergoing chemotherapy, doing a 3-day water fast only, just water prior to chemotherapy, and finding that it's actually chemoprotective for the normal cells, and so that these individuals have less side effects during chemotherapy. So that's another potential mechanism. So there's lots of different ways, but I never think that you should do an extended fast and then look and say, oh, look how much weight I could lose in this short period of time. The weight loss with intermittent fasting, any lifestyle change, is, over a period of time, because that's what you're going to be able to sustain. So that's kind of my take on that. But you will regain some water weight. And then hopefully what will happen is that you have increased your insulin sensitivity. You're continuing to eat well after the extended fast, which would then make weight loss in the subsequent weeks easier. So we are right at 30 minutes. I think there were a lot of good questions. Honestly, there are still 8 questions that I've not answered. So what I will do is I'll get on next Tuesday and just finish out the Q&A. Some of the questions that people asked had to do with fasting and pregnancy, so I definitely want to talk about that. Other people had questions about fasting in the menstrual cycle, so we'll go over some of that next week. And there's a lot of really good questions, so keep asking your questions, guys, and I will reply to them. And thank you so much for tuning in, and hopefully you guys found this helpful, and I'll see you next Tuesday for part 2 of our Q&A. All right, bye.